It seems as though we have a female Archbishop of Canterbury, and the entire Anglican Church is in smithereens for having a woman in charge. Probably. I'll be honest, I wrote this back when it was announced, and it's only now getting posted, mostly because things were going sideways in my family, and I couldn't respond to it at that moment. So I sort of fit it in with this video, which realistically was going to happen anyway at some point. Because back when I rebooted the channel, I did a video entitled Blessed is She, in which I looked at women in the Bible and how they show that women have been empowered across the generations and haven't been seen as second-class citizens. This one being from the first videos I did as part of the new beginning on this channel. I've naturally been reluctant to revisit it, but after some discussion with friends, research into various topics, examination of scriptures I overlooked back then, and of course this revelation, along with several more that have cropped from the news stories and throughout other things, I'm not so sure if things are quite as feminist as I originally summarised. I'm not against second-guessing myself when it comes to the Bible and my studies, but even I don't like finding things that go against an essay I worked so hard on. Regardless of how distasteful I find it to be, I must once more invite you to delve into the Bible, the biblical law, and the history of the understanding of women in our society. This all started with a discussion I had with some old colleagues when I mentioned the video. One said that it's quite possible that great and famous women of their time stood out not because they were allowed to, but because they weren't. It's paraphrasing, but she essentially said that the patriarchal society that we all know and was very much consistent throughout history meant women who stood out in history did so because they were out of their society accepted place. In short, just because we know of strong, respected female leaders of that time doesn't mean they were the norm. It could very well be that they were the exception. One way to look at it is through historical relics that we have, and they might tell us of how women may have been seen. I once came across a video that started with, "Why is a queen worth less than a king?" This was a lass named Mayan who asked her dad, and back in 17, essentially rebranded the playing card as we know it. She cited the outdated gender hierarchy of the common playing card and tried to make a more gender-neutral version simply by matching the monarchs and putting a duchy in the original queen spot, putting princes and princesses in the spot normally reserved for jacks or knaves. This isn't a unique thing, since someone else had a similar idea and branded her own gender-neutral card set, but instead of going for the court cards, she chose precious bars of metal, such as gold, silver, and bronze. Whilst both have their merits and their flaws, they do tend to overlook the history of the game, which isn't too far off the history of chess, a game where the queen is a more valid piece than the king. Whilst king trumps queen in most card games, in chess, a queen is more active than any other piece on the board, and is much more versatile than the king. True, if the king is taken, then the game is over, and there are tons of what could be referred to as political offsetting to make this more complicated. But the fact that the Queen is active enough to be a serious player on the board is not to be underestimated, especially since the modern game evolved in the 15th century in Europe, heavily influenced by the powerful women of the day, including Queen Isabella of Castile, sometimes known as the Catholic due to her fervent faith in Roman Catholicism and a desire to unite Spain under the Catholic Church. Whilst the piece is also known as the minister, or the vizier, or the counsellor in older versions, and is still called such in Eastern cultures, a female piece being stronger and more applicable than the king, the male counterpart, was still a popular game when the king was still trumping a queen. Most people will naturally point out two pieces of scripture that point to women being barred from senior roles in church, or even being allowed to speak in church at all. They are 1 Corinthians 14:34 and 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 12. Both say that women shouldn't teach or have dominion over men. Corinthians going so far as to say it is backed up by the law. However, this isn't shown in the cross-references given on Bible Hub. If we take the law to mean the Old Testament, then Paul's wrong. There doesn't seem to be any ready examples, say from Numbers 30, which is about how vows must be kept, save if a man counsels otherwise, which only shows the attitude towards women at the time, and is mostly to avoid making rash vows that can't be get out of, as the law explains. Even looking at external sources regarding women in the Old Testament, which happen to be heavily anti-religion and therefore heavy on the accusations of misogyny, nothing explicit in the law forbids women from speaking out, save their oaths can be vetoed by man. Furthermore, it seems to contradict Paul and his actions towards the women in his church, who indeed led and taught. This implies either a thorough misunderstanding of the terms, or quite possibly, as many people suggest, an alteration to the scriptures by later Bible translators, all of which is perfectly possible. What cross-references are provided come from similar epistles, few of which, when taken in context, stand out as expressly misogynistic. Ephesians chapter 5 verse 22 is commonly cherry-picked as such, saying women must be submissive only to fall down the second you read the surrounding verses, which tell of both the husband and the wife submitting to each other, and later the husband being Christ-like to the wife. And what exactly did Jesus do for the church? He died. That's not unbalanced. The only thing that seems even remotely supportive of the anti-women sentiment is the classic Eve being tempted by the serpent instead of Adam. However, this is only amped up because people forget one thing. Eve tempted Adam. But some say the serpent was the devil himself who tempted Eve, and thus made her do so to her husband. This isn't a New Age thing, it's there in the text. She didn't even have to tempt man. He just took the fruit that he was given and ate it. So the idea that woman is more susceptible to rash thoughts and temptations is completely false, since she actively denied the devil at first, which is more than some people, and far more than man did with her. Men have done rash, ill-advised things throughout the biblical narrative, and yet apparently remain in God's true favour. This is very much a written thing, you could say, how people put the Bible together, but also people's interpretation and how they looked at it. What other laws exist to suggest the Bible promotes misogyny? Well, some will instantly point out Deuteronomy 22, where it mentions in response to marriage violations. Quite apart from the fact the book clearly points out a different method of divining virginity apart from the assumed hymen, which was never solely relied on even by the ancient Greeks. The laws regarding the rape of a woman aren't as clear cut and dry as one would claim. To talk about the hymen one, you'll have to check out my video Unraveling the Laws. I think that's what it's called anyway. The rape laws, if she wasn't making a noise, that would imply she didn't want to be caught and hence she wanted the action, thus meaning it wasn't rape. The towns might have been nearly as noisy as today, but if you want to make yourself heard in a dark alley, someone would have heard something. The fact that out in the field the woman is not to be blamed for this shows that in the town someone would most certainly have heard something. A human scream is not an easy thing to ignore, even in a crowded modern city like Edinburgh or London. Cities have been getting louder in recent years, so we can presume that the settlement at the time that this law is being written wouldn't be that noisy. Furthermore, since the nation of Israel was a nomadic one, and buildings wouldn't have been soundproofed very well at all, there would be a high chance of a man and woman being discovered and any screams being heard. Thus, it's worthwhile considering that some men, like the ones in the New Testament, would assume the woman was more at fault than the man and punish her. The passage where Jesus was telling people to cast the first stone if he is without sin isn't him refuting the law, it's him pointing out that the law is not what they are saying. It involves both parties, and the men were simply bringing down the woman, not the man. In short, the law isn't against women, but the people enforcing it. I think this misogynistic tendency in human society is exemplified in a part of the Bible that I think will surprise many people. I'm referring to Luke chapter 1, verse 41, which tells of how Mary, the mother of Jesus, visits her relative Elizabeth, who is 6 months pregnant with John the Baptist. It states that as Mary called out, the babe jumped in his mother's womb, and joy filled Elizabeth. Many people say this is a sign that John was responding to the presence of Jesus, therefore showing that life begins at conception, and people at all stages of development respond to God. However, nothing in the text suggests that in any way. In fact, the majority of translations say John responded to the sound of Mary's greeting to Elizabeth. Even the Greek aspasmos means to greet or give salutation, heavily implying it had nothing to do with Jesus. Elizabeth herself said it was the sound of Mary's greeting that her babe reacted to and was filled with the Lord. Thus, her saying, "Blessed is the fruit of your womb." The only time Jesus is mentioned prior to Mary's statement is when Mary asked why the mother of her Lord comes to visit. Knowing the difference between how her baby reacts and how she feels in the presence of God tells us that women are actually more perceptive in the ways of God than the men of the time. This gets overlooked so much, people barely realise how important Mary was. Don't get me wrong, Jesus is important, but not even his birth can completely eclipse the fact that his mother's voice caused someone to be filled with the joy of his Father. The fact that the church teachings prioritize a man, even Jesus, over his mother, when he couldn't have been created out of thin air, shows that the Bible isn't inherently misogynistic, but the people who teach it do so in a manner that ignores the powerful and important women in the Bible, even those who bow down to God and accept his gift without complaint. We give many men in the Bible credit for small things, and yet 2 women have a similar experience of God, and we focus more on their male children, neither of which are born, than what they are showing. One causing a fetus to jump for joy by her mere call, the other having a premonition or sense of her Lord being born to the woman in her presence. How can we ignore what these women are doing in this moment? So, why are we so naturally misogynistic? Some might say it's the hunter-gatherer dynamics, with women doing all the housework and the men doing the hunting. But even societies where these roles are reversed, like the Haenyeo women of Jeju, Korea, the men still hold political office, despite not being the major contributors or even heads of the household. The women are. So, why are men always top dog? My theory is it is down to one thing that many misogynists think women are good for. The only thing that women are good for, apparently. Childbirth. The effect of pregnancy and labour can bring a woman to a near screeching halt. Studies have also shown that 1 in 3 women have long-lasting health effects as a direct result of giving birth. The simple fact that feminine health is less understood in modern medicine, according to some doctors, helps highlight the lack of concrete research. I think the act of childbirth being so shocking and hard on the system of the woman, not to mention the hormones raging in women, making them seem unstable in both pregnancy and when it comes to their child, leaving them weak and vulnerable, lingers in the psyche of men, making them more resentful of them, and thus pushing the idea that women were weak and unable to protect themselves, thus needing a man to support them. As a father, I've seen my partner struggle through morning sickness. I've seen her go through subtle mood swings, very subtle, but you notice them. Taken her to the hospital to manage it, and her health get in the way of managing her day to day, even after giving birth. Having seen how much pregnancy and childbirth takes out of a woman, and that's in a modern hospital with advanced medicine and healthcare, that we have a standard here in the UK. Back in the day, when your only guide through labour is the local midwife, and if you're lucky, someone with a decent understanding of basic surgery, you can understand why women would have been struggling to get up and about immediately after giving birth. And that for the hormones, they would have been thrown around emotionally and left in a vulnerable state where men would have to step in. And that's why it lingers in the minds of men. This wouldn't have given them much chance to take charge of other matters within the home, camp, town, or whatever. Furthermore, this would have affected where they can stand in terms of high-ranking positions of power, since the moment they have a child to care for, they would be required to focus on that alone. Only in the noble houses, where they would have sprung up in the kingdoms of Israel, Sumer, and Egypt, would they be able to take more solid office due to passing off their children to a governess as soon as possible, then even breastfeeding them, thus breaking the parental bond between them and their child. However, this would have put them in a prime position to see what was going on in the main camp, certainly the common woman, where common folk would be doing their daily routine. Whilst it is a stereotype to say that women are focused on the domestic, there is ample examples of female leaders focusing on strength within the group rather than pushing for external power. Probably why Theresa May never got Brexit done, but that's getting way too political. According to a friend of mine, in fact, women became the first converts to the advancing wave of Christendom, which makes the misogyny tendencies of the churchgoers a bit hypocritical. Given the prime position in the community nursing women had in those days, it would have actually been more appropriate, because not only did they have time to listen to the missionaries whilst doing their daily work, they would also be able to share and discuss it with others in the community, allowing the teachings of Jesus Christ to become a broad topic of conversation within common society, making them the ideal teachers of his word. In fact, quite possibly, it would have slipped in under the radar of men that would have been very zealous or even against the idea. Thus, it would have been the women who brought Christianity to the masses, not the men. It's also worthwhile noting that it's often those who are downtrodden in the eyes of society that get raised to prominence in the eyes of God. Even in history, calling the Right Reverend and Right Honourable Dame Sarah Mullally the first female head of the Church of England is demonstrably false. Since its founding in 1534, it has had no fewer than 6 female heads: Mary Tudor, Elizabeth Tudor, Mary Stuart, Anne Stuart, Victoria Hanover, and Elizabeth Windsor. The monarch has always been the head of the Anglican Church, and every sovereign queen or co-ruling queen had been since the founding of the church. Since they choose the archbishops and the church has lasted this long, I don't think God is angry that the church is now run by a woman, especially since the position was held by a woman for 70 years, that being Elizabeth II. The exception was possibly Empress Matilda in the 12th century, though she's one of the disputed, along with Lady Jane Grey. Before anyone jumps in, no, Queen Camilla doesn't count, she's not a reigning sovereign, nor will Princess Catherine. One final thing to note, especially since some people throw the idea that women being in church is rather Stockholm Syndrome. Stephen Carter did a study into which demographic had the highest percentage of Christians. His discoveries, both in the USA and worldwide, showed it was women of colour. That's right. Far from attacking the KKK leadership. If you attack Christians, you're more likely attacking those who have been victimized by the KKK. If anything, you're helping them. So the Bible isn't to blame for misogyny, but it appears to be a heavy bias in men of the day and is still inbuilt today. Many things in our society make us focus on those that do great things in life and ignores those who work hard in the background. We may look on things in the past and blame it on the most prominent thing in society, God and the church being one. But when we examine the things that we put the blame on, we see that it's far less about where we justify it, but more where we want to see it. If we want to see misogyny, we unfortunately see it. If we want justification for sexist remarks, we will have them. And that is unfortunately the case in science as well. People will say that testosterone gives us strength, and others will say, yes, that means that we're stronger than women. That's not what it says. That's just not. But that has always been the case with many things. Mankind has been ignoring the work of women for hundreds of years. And when we look back on it in the light of our feminist enlightenment, we only see the pages we justify it as a source, when really it is us it comes from. As many historians pointed out, often things get oppressed by those that don't want us to know. Man is perfectly capable of evil, hatred, and bigotry without the help of a book that has verses apparently pertaining to it. We just need to point at something to justify it. So, long live the Archbishop. Happy Mothering Sunday. Stay safe. And God be with you, my friends.